back on the air. Because we've known each other for over 20 years. I know you as a friend, and here's something I didn't know, is that you're funny.
For 9 straight years, Stephen Colbert sat behind the most-watched desk in network late night. He beat Jimmy Fallon. He beat Jimmy Kimmel. He turned CBS's aging franchise into appointment television, night after night, in a genre most analysts had already written off as dying. And then, without warning, it was over. Not because the audience left, not because the jokes stopped landing, but because of a decision that still doesn't fully add up, tangled up in an $8 billion merger, a lawsuit from a sitting president, and a settlement Colbert himself called disgraceful on his own network's air. Months after the axe fell, Colbert finally opened up about why. When his friend and rival Jimmy Kimmel offered him a real, public, generous lifeline back behind a desk, he turned it down. The real answer is stranger and far more human than anyone guessed. To understand it, we have to go back to the very beginning. Picture this. You are the reigning champion of your entire field. You have been for nearly a decade, fending off younger, flashier competitors every single night. Then, out of nowhere, your employer tells you the whole operation is shutting down anyway. That is essentially what happened to Stephen Colbert in the summer of 2025, when CBS confirmed that The Late Show would air its final episode in May of 2026, closing out not just his run, but the franchise itself. What made the news land like a gut punch across the industry wasn't just the cancellation itself. It was the timing and the numbers behind it. Colbert wasn't limping to the finish line, propped up by nostalgia or inertia. He had spent 9 consecutive television seasons as the highest-rated host in the 11:30 time slot, regularly outpacing NBC's Jimmy Fallon and ABC's Jimmy Kimmel in total viewers, week after week, year after year. For a network executive, that kind of consistency is usually untouchable. Hosts get canceled for falling ratings, for aging demographics, for losing cultural relevance. Colbert had none of those problems. He was, by every conventional measure television usually cares about, winning. It's worth remembering how improbable that dominance even was in the first place. When David Letterman retired in 2015 after more than 3 decades behind the desk, CBS took a real gamble, handing the keys to a man best known for playing a fictional blowhard conservative pundit on cable television. Nobody was certain Stephen Colbert, the character, could translate into Stephen Colbert, the sincere network host. For the first year or two, frankly, he didn't quite manage it. Jimmy Fallon dominated the ratings during that stretch, riding a wave of viral games, lip-sync battles, and celebrity bits that ruled the still-emerging world of YouTube clips. Colbert's show, by contrast, felt like it was still searching for its voice, still deciding what kind of host he wanted to be now that the ironic mask was gone. Then Donald Trump entered the political arena as a presidential candidate, and something in Colbert's show shifted almost overnight. He leaned hard into pointed, topical political commentary in his opening monologues, treating the news cycle less like fodder for jokes and more like the central engine of the entire show. Audiences responded immediately. By the 2016 to 2017 television season, he had overtaken Fallon for good, beginning a run of dominance that would ultimately last almost a full decade. Even CBS's own leadership acknowledged it publicly over the years, with the network's top executive once describing Colbert, without qualification, as the network's best performer in that entire time slot. So when CBS finally announced the end, the explanation it offered surprised a lot of people who had watched Colbert's ratings for years. The network insisted the decision had nothing to do with ratings, content, or performance at all. In a joint statement, Paramount and CBS leadership said the show would end its historic run in May 2026, calling Colbert irreplaceable and describing the move as purely a financial decision against a difficult backdrop for late night, unrelated in any way to the show's performance, content, or anything else happening at Paramount. On its face, that explanation isn't crazy, and it would be unfair to dismiss it entirely. Late-night television as a business has been bleeding money for years as advertisers chase streaming audiences and younger viewers abandon linear TV altogether in favor of clips, podcasts, and short-form video. Reports later surfaced suggesting The Late Show was losing tens of millions of dollars annually despite its ratings lead. A genuine and serious financial headache for any media company trying to justify a nightly production budget in 2025. But the timing of the announcement made a purely financial explanation nearly impossible for a lot of people to accept at face value. Because just 3 days before that announcement went public, Colbert had done something almost unheard of in the entire history of network television. He turned his own monologue against the very company that signed his checks. Late-night hosts mock politicians constantly. It's practically the job description. They rarely, if ever, mock their own bosses on air, because doing so risks the kind of career consequences most performers simply cannot afford. But 3 days before his cancellation was announced, Colbert broke that unwritten rule in dramatic, unmistakable fashion. The subject was a settlement. Paramount, CBS's parent company, had agreed to pay $16 million to resolve a lawsuit filed by Donald Trump, who claimed a 60 Minutes interview with then Vice President Kamala Harris had been deceptively edited to help her campaign in the closing weeks of the election. CBS denied any wrongdoing throughout the process, insisting its editorial decisions followed standard broadcast practice. Many legal observers were openly skeptical the lawsuit had real merit in the first place, which made the decision to settle, and the size of the settlement itself, all the more eye-braising to industry watchers who follow these disputes closely. What made the timing especially suspicious was the corporate backdrop unfolding at exactly the same moment. Paramount was in the middle of finalizing a massive merger with Skydance Media, a deal that needed sign-off from federal regulators, including the Federal Communications Commission, before it could close. Settling a presidential lawsuit right as you need government approval for an $8 billion transaction is precisely the kind of coincidence that invites scrutiny, even if the company insists, as it did repeatedly, that the two situations were never connected in any formal way. Colbert wasn't shy about connecting them himself, live, in front of a studio audience and millions of viewers at home. Opening his show, he told the audience he was offended, describing himself as a proud, longtime employee of the network who felt genuinely let down by what had happened. He didn't mince words about the settlement, dismissing it on air as nothing more than a payoff dressed up as a legal resolution, a jab that drew a massive laugh and round of applause in the room. The studio audience roared. Outside the theater, though, the moment landed very differently. A comedian roasting a president is expected, even celebrated. A comedian publicly accusing his own corporate parent of essentially buying regulatory goodwill is something else entirely. A much riskier and more pointed act of institutional criticism. The response was immediate and loud, spreading well beyond entertainment circles. Fellow comedians rushed to Colbert's defense within hours. David Letterman, the man whose chair Colbert had inherited a decade earlier, publicly criticized the network's decision. Lawmakers, including Senator Elizabeth Warren, raised pointed questions in public about whether political pressure had played a role in ending the show. None of it changed the outcome. The decision, according to CBS, had already been finalized before the backlash even had a chance to build. To really understand what happened to Colbert, you have to zoom out and look at the enormous business deal quietly reshaping the entire company around him. Paramount Global's proposed merger with Skydance Media, first announced in the summer of 2024, was valued at roughly $8 billion, one of the largest media transactions in years. It would hand control of the combined company to Skydance founder David Ellison, backed by Redbird Capital Partners and a consortium of other investors. Because CBS owns dozens of local television stations licensed by the federal government, the merger needed formal sign-off from the Federal Communications Commission, along with additional review under federal antitrust law. That put an enormous amount riding on staying in the good graces of regulators, at exactly the moment a sitting president happened to be suing the network's own news division over an interview edit. Then everything seemed to collide at once, in a sequence that felt almost too tightly compressed to be coincidental. The lawsuit, the settlement, Colbert's monologue, the cancellation, and running underneath all of it, quietly but constantly, Paramount's continued push to get its merger across the finish line before regulatory patience or political winds could shift again. After the deal was eventually approved, the FCC chairman at the time made public comments suggesting the new ownership, wanted to shift the direction of CBS News and address what it viewed as bias inside the newsroom, remarks that only added fuel to speculation that editorial independence itself was being quietly renegotiated behind closed doors as part of the broader transaction. Not long after, high-profile departures shook CBS News from the inside. The network's news president and a longtime executive producer at 60 Minutes both exited amid reported friction over editorial control during the ownership transition, exits that insiders described as far from routine. Around the same time, a well-known journalist and outspoken media commentator was installed as the new editor-in-chief of CBS News, a hire that itself became an instant lightning rod given her long history of criticizing what she called ideological conformity inside major American newsrooms. Taken together, it's a genuinely remarkable convergence of forces: a comedy show, a presidential lawsuit, a multi-billion-dollar merger, federal regulators, a newsroom leadership shakeup, and a fierce national political argument, all tangled into the same handful of weeks. It's easy to see why so many people struggle to believe the official financial explanation told the entire story. But CBS's cancellation wasn't the end of the drama surrounding Colbert. In many ways, it was only the moment the entire industry started fighting back on his behalf. Within hours of the announcement, what might have been a quiet corporate footnote in a trade publication instead turned into one of the biggest public disputes late-night television had seen in years. This wasn't just fans mourning the loss of a favorite host. It was comedians, veteran broadcasters, journalists, and media watchdogs all publicly pushing back on the idea that this decision was purely about money. Jimmy Kimmel became one of Colbert's loudest and most visible defenders almost immediately. Rather than air a fresh episode of his own show opposite Colbert's farewell broadcast, Kimmel made the unusual choice to run a rerun instead, urging his own audience directly to spend that particular night watching Colbert say goodbye rather than tuning into ABC. It was an unusually generous, almost countercultural gesture in an industry that has always been built around fierce nightly ratings competition between rival hosts. Kimmel went even further in the months that followed. He extended Colbert an open invitation to join the rotating cast of guest hosts filling in on Jimmy Kimmel Live during his annual summer hiatus, a lineup that would go on to include well-known names like Tiffany Haddish, Ike Barinholtz, Coleman Domingo, Anthony Anderson, Rosie O'Donnell, and Jelly Roll across the season. For most displaced television hosts suddenly without a nightly platform, stepping into a familiar, high-visibility chair during a summer slot would be the obvious, almost irresistible move. Colbert notably said no. Kimmel later opened up about the exchange in detail during an interview promoting his own upcoming season, explaining candidly that he had genuinely extended the offer and that Colbert felt the timing simply wasn't right yet. Kimmel recalled telling him that whenever he wanted to host, it didn't matter whether it was summer or any other time of year, he would gladly step aside for him without hesitation. It wasn't, in other words, a rejection of the friendship, or of Kimmel's platform, or of the audience that still clearly wanted to see him. It was, in Colbert's own framing as relayed by Kimmel, simply too soon. That single word, premature, carried more weight than it might seem on the surface. Kimmel understood the instinct behind it better than almost anyone else working in the industry, because he had lived through his own version of sudden institutional whiplash just months earlier. In September of 2025, ABC abruptly pulled Jimmy Kimmel Live off the air entirely after a monologue addressing the assassination of conservative activist Charlie Kirk. Contrary to a great deal of the early headlines that circulated online within hours, Kimmel never joked about or celebrated Kirk's death in any way. His actual criticism was aimed squarely at certain political figures who he felt were rushing to spin the tragedy for immediate political advantage before the facts of the case were even settled. That crucial distinction got lost almost instantly in the resulting firestorm. Conservative commentators, sitting politicians, and major ABC affiliate station owners accused him of poor judgment and worse, and the pressure escalated quickly enough that ABC suspended the show indefinitely while network executives scrambled to figure out how to respond to the mounting backlash. More than 400 actors, writers, and producers signed an open letter condemning the suspension as a direct attack on free expression, a list that notably included a number of conservatives who disagreed with Kimmel's politics, but nonetheless defended his right to say what he believed on his own program. 6 days later, ABC reversed course entirely and brought the show back to air. In his emotional return monologue, a visibly shaken Kimmel clarified once again that he never intended to make light of a young man's murder and explained that his criticism had always been directed at how the tragedy was being politicized in its immediate aftermath, never at the victim himself. The parallels between what happened to Kimmel and what happened to Colbert were not lost on anyone paying close attention to the industry that year. Two of Donald Trump's most persistent and outspoken late-night critics, both suddenly caught up in serious institutional crises within months of each other, both forced to publicly defend intentions that had been badly distorted in the retelling online. It's not hard to see why. When Kimmel offered his friend a genuine way back into the spotlight, Colbert hesitated rather than jumping at the chance. He had just watched, in real time and from close proximity, how quickly the ground can shift under a host's feet, and how genuinely exhausting it can be to fight your way back onto the air only to relive the same battles all over again in front of a different audience. Both men, in their own distinct ways, learned essentially the same painful lesson that year. Public perception moves far faster than the truth ever can, and once a narrative takes hold online, walking it back convincingly takes days of careful, deliberate, often thankless work. For Kimmel, that work happened live and fast, under enormous public pressure, in front of the very audience he needed to win back before ratings and advertisers walked away for good. For Colbert, the lesson landed rather differently. He no longer had a show of his own to defend or explain. He had, instead, the rarer and arguably far harder task of quietly deciding what to do with silence, without cameras rolling and without a studio audience waiting for a punchline. To really understand why Colbert reacted the way he did to Kimmel's offer, it helps enormously to understand who he actually is underneath the tailored suits and the nightly monologues. Long before late night ever entered the picture, Stephen Colbert's entire life was reshaped by devastating personal loss. In September of 1974, when he was only 10 years old, his father and two of his older brothers were killed in a plane crash outside Charlotte, North Carolina. His father had been a respected dean at Yale's medical school at the time of his death. Colbert has spoken openly, and often quite movingly, over the years about how that early loss reshaped nearly everything about him as a person. He has consistently credited his mother's remarkable resilience and enduring sense of humor with holding what remained of the family together through the worst of it, and he has remained a practicing Catholic throughout his entire adult life, describing his faith as something that helped him make sense of an otherwise senseless tragedy. In a widely discussed conversation with Anderson Cooper, another public figure who experienced profound loss at a young age, Colbert reflected candidly that he had come to feel a strange, almost paradoxical kind of gratitude even for the things he wished had never happened at all, explaining that suffering had, over time, deepened his capacity for genuine empathy toward other people. That instinct toward patient reflection over quick, reactive decision-making shows up again and again throughout his entire career, long before any of this recent controversy began. After training seriously in improvisational comedy at Chicago's famed Second City Theater, he joined The Daily Show under Jon Stewart in the late 1990s, where he quickly became one of the program's most memorable and distinctive correspondents. In 2005, he launched The Colbert Report, playing an exaggerated, self-serious conservative pundit for nearly a full decade, without ever once breaking character on camera. A genuinely remarkable creative and professional discipline that won him multiple Emmy Awards and permanently reshaped how audiences thought about political satire on television. His single most famous moment from that entire era wasn't even delivered on his own show. At the 2006 White House Correspondents' Dinner, standing just a few feet away from President George W. Bush and members of his administration, Colbert delivered a scathing satirical routine mocking the Iraq War and the uncomfortably cozy relationship between government officials and the press covering them. The room itself went noticeably quiet, almost uneasy. Online, though, the clip exploded almost immediately, becoming one of the earliest and most cited examples of an awkward live event being transformed into a lasting cultural phenomenon well after the actual banquet had ended. When he eventually took over The Late Show in 2015, Colbert wasn't simply filling Letterman's old chair out of obligation. He was quietly reinventing himself all over again, deliberately trading the ironic satirical mask for something closer to his own genuine voice and perspective. It took real time to click with audiences, but as the political climate intensified around him, so did his show, eventually carrying him to 9 consecutive seasons at the very top of the ratings. That's a man, in other words, who has spent his entire adult life learning how to sit patiently with difficult moments rather than rushing past them toward whatever comes next. So when he says the timing of Kimmel's offer felt premature, it tracks closely with everything we already know about how he tends to process major personal and professional upheaval. He doesn't perform recovery for an audience simply because the calendar says it's time. He waits until it feels real to him first. Friends and former colleagues who have worked alongside him for years describe the exact same underlying pattern going back decades. Long before The Late Show ever existed, Colbert rarely, if ever, makes a major emotional decision in public before he has genuinely made peace with it in private first. That deeply ingrained habit, forged in tragedy long before fame ever entered the picture, may be the single clearest thread connecting the grieving 10-year-old boy in Charleston to the 61-year-old television host who politely, but firmly, turned down his friend's generous invitation. Since leaving CBS, Colbert hasn't announced any return to late-night television, and he hasn't signed a confirmed deal with any streaming platform or rival network, despite persistent rumors of podcasts or entirely new projects circulating in entertainment media. Instead, he appears to be deliberately pivoting toward passion projects outside the nightly grind of a talk show, including serving as an executive producer on The Lord of the Rings, The Hunt for Gollum, drawing on a lifelong, well-documented love of Tolkien's work that long predates his entire television career. Meanwhile, the late-night landscape he leaves behind looks different than the one he entered a decade earlier. Jimmy Kimmel's ratings have actually climbed measurably since Colbert's departure, with reports showing some of the strongest monthly numbers of his entire 23-year run, suggesting that at least a meaningful portion of Colbert's old audience has migrated directly over to Kimmel's program in the interim. The standing invitation Kimmel extended hasn't expired either, and he has made clear the door stays open, summer hiatus or not, whenever Colbert decides the moment feels right. CBS, for its part, continues to insist publicly that the cancellation was purely about economics, pointing to genuine, industry-wide financial pressure bearing down on the traditional 11:30 format. And to be fair, it is genuinely true that advertising revenue across network television has been sliding for years now, as viewers steadily migrate towards streaming, social media, and on-demand platforms in ever greater numbers. But the extraordinary timing, the settlement, the merger, and the newsroom shakeup that followed almost immediately afterward all continue to fuel a very different theory among seasoned industry watchers, one that may never be fully confirmed one way or the other by either company. What we do know now, drawing directly from Colbert's own camp and Kimmel's own words in that recent interview, is actually far simpler than any sprawling corporate conspiracy theory. Colbert simply wasn't ready yet, not to sit behind someone else's desk, however welcoming the invitation, not to perform a version of normalcy for a national audience, while he was still quietly figuring out what came next for himself. In an industry built around never missing a beat, Stephen Colbert made the deliberate choice to miss one on purpose, fully aware of what that might cost him. And given everything the man has lived through across his 61 years, that quiet, unhurried patience might just be the most honest and human answer of all. Zoom out even further, and Colbert's story stops looking like an isolated incident and starts looking like a symptom of something much larger happening across the entire television industry. Late night, as a format, has been under sustained financial pressure for the better part of a decade, and Colbert's cancellation was hardly the only high-profile casualty during this stretch. Streaming platforms don't need a nightly monologue to compete for attention. Younger viewers increasingly experience these shows through 6-minute clips on social media rather than sitting through a full 30-minute broadcast, which quietly guts the traditional advertising model that used to fund these programs in the first place. That shift helps explain why even a dominant, highly rated show like Colbert's could still be losing tens of millions a year behind the scenes. Production costs for a live, nightly network program remain stubbornly high, from crew salaries to studio overhead to booking talent, while the advertising dollars that once covered those costs have steadily drained toward digital platforms that target audiences more cheaply. Executives across the industry have openly questioned whether the traditional 11:30 format can even survive much longer, regardless of who sits behind the desk. Seen through that lens, Colbert's exit and Kimmel's near exit look less like isolated political controversies and more like early tremors in a bigger structural shift already underway. Whether or not political pressure played a role in either decision, and people disagree sharply on that question, the financial ground under the entire genre has clearly been shifting for years. That context doesn't erase the suspicious timing surrounding Colbert's cancellation, but it does help explain why a network might have wanted a convenient moment to make a costly, controversial cut. And that is the story. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this one, consider liking the video, dropping a comment with your own take, and subscribing so you don't miss what's coming next.